There's a Latin phrase, so of course I love it, damnatio memoriae, if I'm saying it right. That means to condemn the memory of something or usually someone. And what would happen is a Roman emperor who had a rival, maybe his predecessor, maybe a brother, who would take office and then do anything to eradicate any trace of his nemesis. Any statue would be destroyed, or at least the face chiseled out. Any painting would be painting over. Any mosaic would be destroyed, and any law passed by that person would be repealed. The idea was to turn that person and their entire works and their entire history into a wisp, a rumor, a nothing. Now, we only know about the unsuccessful cases of damnatio memoriae, where there's a trace left, where they missed a statue or a mosaic. We have no idea. How could we know if it was actually successful on anyone? Could you imagine that? If we simply had an entire chapter of our history gone because someone didn't like a rival. How barbaric, how uncivilizational, how ahistorical. Well, you may be thinking, well, we are doing that today, aren't we? I am in Toronto, where at Queen's Park, which is the name of the provincial parliament, there is an enormous statue of Sir John A. Macdonald, the founder of this country, but it is in a giant wooden sarcophagus, a coffin built around Sir John A. So you never have to look at him again. He's been stripped from our $10 bill, and they're certainly not stopping there. In fact, if you can damn the memory of the founding father of Confederation, you can damn the memory of anyone else, and Toronto's amongst the worst of it. They renamed Ryerson University because of something he allegedly did. And 200 years ago, there was a great statesman, a little more than that, named Henry Dundas, who was a key political leader in the British Empire and had roots in Ontario. And it is after him that the town of Dundas and Ontario is named, Dundas Street. And if you've ever been to Toronto, you may know that in the downtown, there's this lively square. It's sort of Canada's version of Times Square. There's theaters, there's restaurants, there's giant billboard ads, and it's teeming with people and buskers and food trucks. That's called Young Dundas Square. But wouldn't you know it, today's damnatio memoriae practitioners, today's censors and cancel culturers, they've drawn a target on Henry Dundas, and they actually propose to rip out the name, to rename everything in the city that bears the word Dundas, including libraries and roads and, 4,500 businesses. Here's Toronto Mayor Olivia Chow, a city racked by crime, homelessness, high taxes, transportation issues. No, she has a higher priority. She must condemn the memory of a man she knows very little about. Listen to Olivia Chow, the socialist mayor, condemning Henry Dundas and getting her facts wrong, by the way. Take a look.
Dundas delayed the cancellation and the abolition of slavery for many years. He also promoted taking children, young girls and boys, to take them away from their parents and bring them to England, to other parts of Europe as slaves so they could multiply, procreate, so there will be enough people, enough labor, slave labor, in order to service the plantations. Surely you're not comparing a slave owner. Well, and it's not, I don't know whether it's a slave owner or not. But allow me to finish. The motion that Councillor Moyse will be bringing forward address this. I do know the pain of losing a loved one. I understand that. That is why I supported Councillor Ainsley's motion to name a football stadium, because I understood what that meant for the Ford family. I certainly understood how painful it was for a young person to die prematurely. And that's why it's in front of the agenda today.
Could you imagine spending, the new estimate is $12.7 million. Of course, it'll be many times that. But what about the fact that if there's someone 200 years ago who doesn't meet our latest political fashion, even if it's a slur against them, a defamation that they can't defend, what about the idea that we simply tear things down, tear down our history? It's actually, if you read the book 1984, what the hero of the book, Winston Smith, did for a living. He would go into work and every day he would rewrite historical accounts to change them to fit with political fashions. Well, I've got some strong views on this subject, but I'm not an expert in it. But fortunately, we have someone joining us today who is. Her name is Jennifer Dundas, and as you can detect, she's actually a descendant of Henry Dundas, and she is one of the Dundas family members who is campaigning against this eradication of our history, campaigning against this Roman practice of damnatio memoriae, this past tense cancel culture. And she joins us now via Skype. Jennifer, what a pleasure to meet you. Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you so much, Ezra. Pleasure to be here.
Well, it's troubling to me that we want to destroy our past. And in that brief conversation that we played where Mayor Olivia Chow was talking about Henry Dundas, you can see she has a very weak grasp of who he is, who he was, and what he did. She accuses him of being a slaveholder, then immediately pulls that back. I mean, she really knows nothing about the man. Why don't you tell us, as someone who is descended from him and someone who has studied him, obviously, who exactly was Henry Dundas and why has he for 2 centuries been celebrated in Ontario? Why are so many things named after him? Tell me the truth about Henry Dundas.
Those are a lot of questions that I could go on for a long time about, but I'll just start by telling you the big picture about Henry Dundas. He was the most powerful politician in Scotland for a good 3 decades at the end of the 18th century, early 19th, and was a Secretary of State, including Home Secretary, War Secretary during the Revolutionary Wars with France. And during that time, the abolition movement in Britain rose up. He was actually one of the very first participants in that. In 1776, he had just been elected. He was the Lord Advocate, which is like a Solicitor General, Attorney General for Scotland. And he volunteered his time. He worked pro bono to represent a Black slave who was fighting for his freedom in the Scottish courts. And he took that case up to Scotland's highest court. And not only did he win freedom for that slave who had been brought to Scotland from Jamaica, he won a declaration from the court that nobody could be a slave on Scottish soil.
Wow.
Really big decision. He made legal history, basically, in Scotland when he won that case for Joseph Knight. A couple of decades later, not quite, the abolition movement regarding the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade picks up some speed. It had been rumbling for a long time, but William Wilberforce brought that to the forefront of Parliament's agenda. And he was trying to get abolition of the slave trade alone. Henry Dundas stepped in and said, "You're not going to be successful. The forces lined up against this are too powerful, and it will just go underground. And the Caribbean slave owners will continue buying their slaves from other traders. It just won't work. So if you really want to shut down the slave trade, you have to shut down the slave trade and slavery together." And so he brought forward a motion to that effect and said that that abolition should happen gradually. And his vision was that within 7 or 8 years, the entire slave trade would be abolished. And within a generation, slavery itself would be abolished, because every child born to a slave would be born free and would have to be educated at the expense of the owner of the parents. So he that was his contribution.
So
now he is.
let me stop you there just for 1 second. I'm sorry to interrupt. I just want to get this point clear because I think this is very interesting, if I heard you right, that Henry Dundas himself introduced this proposal. Is that correct?
He was responding to William Wilberforce, who had brought a motion in 1792 for the immediate abolition of the slave trade, complete, total abolition overnight. Henry Dundas said in 1792, that's not going to work. So he brought in an amendment. He introduced an amendment. His amendment was successful for gradual abolition. And
got it. And this was for the slave trade as well as slave ownership, because there's different levels. Yes. There's the slave trade. There's having slaves. There's the emancipation of children of slaves. I know that this sounds like it's petty details, but it's actually, each of these was an important breakthrough. It marked the end of, I mean, for example, if every child born to a slave is born free, right there, that's a time limit on slavery in itself. Each of these is an important step. So which were the things that Henry Dundas was pushing for? The end of the slave trade? And go ahead.
What he is criticized for is the fact that he took William Wilberforce's motion and proposed an amendment that abolition should be gradual. And in his speech in support of that amendment, he laid out his plan. And his plan was to eradicate or abolish the slave trade within a time to be determined, later determined to be 7 or 8 years, and that slavery itself would be eradicated by eliminating what they called hereditary slavery. So if a person owned a slave, they also owned the children of those slaves. He would have put an end to that so that every child born to a slave after that would be a free person entitled to education, although there was also this idea that the child would have to work to pay back the cost of their education. Nonetheless, within a generation, his proposal would have eradicated slavery within a generation.